In a world where wealth and ambition reign, the seemingly perfect life of billionaire Ethan Cole unravels in the shadow of betrayal, loss, and redemption. This is a tale of love, trust, and the devastating consequences of deception, a story that reminds us that no amount of success can replace the sanctity of human connection. Join me as we explore the tragedy of Ethan Cole, Grace Cole, and Eliza Martin, a cautionary tale of desire and the fragile balance between ambition and morality. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss stories that inspire and spark meaningful change. Now, let's dive into this unforgettable tale. Ethan Cole was a name that symbolized unbounded ambition and relentless drive. An unassuming boy from Rochester, New York, Ethan had clawed his way to the top of the business world with a potent combination of ingenuity and force of will. His earliest memories involved hustling at swap meets beside his father, who sold cheap plastic knickknacks out of the trunk of their battered Buick. Looking back on that modest life, Ethan never could have imagined that one day he would be among the wealthiest men in America, rubbing shoulders with leaders of industry and invited to speak on panels alongside the likes of Bill Gates and Warren Buffett. Yet here he was, at 39 years old, lord of a global real estate empire, commanding wealth that seemed incomprehensible to most people. One brisk December evening, Ethan and his wife, Grace Cole, glided into the glass-paneled lobby of the Wilshire Plaza Hotel in Los Angeles. The doorman tipped his hat, welcoming them to a charity gala in support of children's mental health. The Cole family's philanthropic presence had become a crucial part of their public image, as Grace often reminded him, "You've made your billions, Ethan. Now it's time to use them wisely." Standing side by side on the red carpet, their names were called out in a flurry of camera shutters. Journalists scurried around them, snapping photos. The philanthropic pair cut a dashing figure, Ethan in a custom-tailored navy suit, his platinum cufflinks glinting under the lights, and Grace in a flowing emerald gown that showed off her elegant frame. There was a time when Ethan and Grace's marriage had been built on a bedrock of genuine affection. They had met over a decade ago, when Ethan was on the cusp of his first major investment deal, and Grace was an idealistic graduate student in art history at Columbia University. Grace came from an old money family known for their refined tastes and long-standing philanthropic legacy. From the moment Ethan had first spoken to her over coffee in the Manhattan winter, he had been enchanted by her compassion, her sense of justice, and her steadfast moral compass. In those days, Ethan was not yet calloused by corporate warfare or overshadowed by the unrelenting demands of wealth. He was still full of dreams, often sneaking away from high-pressure negotiations just to spend time with Grace, discussing art and strolling through the Met. They would whisper their visions for a future built on both passion and purpose. It was a world of possibility that felt limitless and exhilarating, but marriages evolve, and not always in sync. Over the years, as Ethan's empire expanded, so did the responsibilities and stresses strapped onto his shoulders. Problems came in waves, unscrupulous associates seeking to dip into his pockets, shifting global economic headwinds, putting his real estate holdings at risk, and public expectations that he reinvest in philanthropic causes beyond what he sometimes felt comfortable giving. Through it all, Grace stayed by his side, radiating calm and moral certainty in a life swirling with complexities. He was grateful, but a part of him felt caged. There was a chasm forming. Grace was drawn to philanthropic events, academic conferences, and non-profit board meetings that bored Ethan to tears. Meanwhile, Ethan was seduced by the thrill of deals worth billions, the prestige of wealth, and the chance to rub shoulders with the world's movers and shakers. These diverging paths had become so wide that intimacy and passion between them were often overshadowed by orchestrated public appearances and carefully curated social media updates. Still, the night of the Wilshire Plaza Charity Gala was supposed to be a moment of celebration. Ethereal music from the strings ensemble floated in the air. Candle-lit centerpieces adorned round tables covered in fine linen. When the auction commenced, Ethan took the stage. He spoke about the importance of supporting vulnerable communities, referencing how he had once been among the children that these charities claim to protect. Applause punctuated his speech. Journalists scribbled into their notepads or typed furiously into their tablets. Grace beamed with pride, though part of her wondered if Ethan's words were from the heart or from a place of social obligation. Their eyes met, and Ethan gave a reassuring smile as if to confirm his sincerity. Days later, in the hush of their Beverly Hills mansion, Ethan stared out from the floor-to-ceiling windows in his home office. The iconic sprawl of Los Angeles spread below him like a toy city, headlights painting ribbons of light across distant freeways. Minimalist white shelves lined with corporate awards, photographs of him with various presidents, and tokens from philanthropic events filled the space behind him. He sipped from a glass of single malt scotch. In moments of doubt, he liked to imagine life had played out differently. Maybe he would have found a simpler happiness. But Ethan knew he was too far gone in his own ambition to turn back now. Grace was in the middle of a phone call with her mother, who was experiencing health issues up in Napa Valley. A faint, worried conversation wafted across the hallway. Ever since Grace's father passed away, her mother, Constance Huntington, had become more frail, often needing help with daily tasks. With Grace's engagements in Los Angeles, the arrangement of having a personal nurse was inevitable. Over time, Constance had cycled through a few caregivers, none of whom had been quite the right fit. One was too inexperienced, another was kind but scattered, and a third simply couldn't handle Constance's heart condition. "Ethan," Grace said, hanging up the phone, "I need you to come to Napa with me tomorrow. Mother is meeting someone new, a nurse recommended by a friend. She could be the perfect caretaker." Ethan's mind was on a major property acquisition. He had been slated to fly to New York for negotiations. "Tomorrow?" he asked, swirling his scotch. "We can't just bring your mother to LA and meet the nurse here." Grace sighed, stepping into his office. She looked tired, the stress of juggling philanthropy, family obligations, and the demands of being a billionaire's wife all draining her. "This nurse is set on meeting your mother on her own turf, seeing her routine. The health insurance forms are also easier to handle up there. It'll only take a day or two." He relented. There was no use arguing. Grace was fiercely devoted to her mother's well-being, and it was something that Ethan, despite all his cynicism, admired about her. The next morning, they flew by private jet to Napa Valley, lush vineyards stretched out beneath them as they landed. The crisp air and rolling hills offered a stark contrast to the bustle of LA. Constance's estate lay on a gentle slope, overlooking miles of well-tended grapes and old oak trees. The main house was an elegant two-story villa with Mediterranean-style arches. Grace's childhood had been spent weaving through these halls, climbing the trees in the orchard, and reading thick novels in the window seat that offered a perfect vantage point of the valley. The caretaker's quarters were a modest wing near the rear of the house, close enough to respond in any emergency, yet far enough to afford privacy. Ethan felt a wave of nostalgia. In the early days of dating Grace, he had visited here often. She used to tease him about how he looked uncomfortable in his meticulously polished loafers, trying to navigate the gravel driveway without scuffing them. Back then, her mother was robust and spirited, an excellent hostess who believed in dinner parties for every life occasion. But the passage of time had not been kind to Constance. Now, she spent much of her day resting or in the garden for mild walks. Once inside, Grace guided Ethan to the family room. He spotted Constance in a rose-embroidered armchair, sipping tea. Despite her silver hair and the lines on her face, there was an undeniable aura of grace about her. She greeted him warmly before pointing down the hallway. "She's arrived already," Constance said, a slight smile on her lips. "Eliza Martin. She's just putting her things away in the caretaker's quarters." Grace smiled, clearly relieved. "Thank you for doing this, Mother. I really believe she'll be the perfect nurse for you." In that moment, If anyone had told Ethan that this unassuming nurse, Eliza Martin, would soon upend his life, testing every ounce of loyalty and morality he had, he would have laughed. From where he stood, this was just another staff addition, another person in the background. Ethan looked toward the hallway, expecting to greet the new hire. He planned to say the usual pleasantries, perhaps a handshake, and then slip away to manage business calls. In his mind, the nurse was just another figure passing through the orbit of the wealthy Cole family. Little did he know that his illusions of control were on the brink of destruction. It was an irony that in a life orchestrated around monumental sums of money, the real storms often stemmed from the heart. As Ethan was about to learn, ambition without emotional grounding could make one dangerously susceptible to temptations lurking in the shadows. And so began the subtle unraveling of the perfect image Ethan Cole had so painstakingly built around himself. Ethan had barely set his phone on silent, ready to momentarily escape the constant barrage of emails, when he felt Grace's gentle nudge on his arm. "She's here," Grace whispered. He looked up, curiosity dancing in his eyes, to see a young woman step through the hallway. She was dressed in an understated white blouse and dark slacks, practical attire for a professional nurse, yet there was something about her that felt unexpectedly poised. Eliza Martin had a warm but reserved smile. She carried herself with a quiet confidence that belied her slender frame, and her auburn hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail. "Mrs. Huntington, it's such a pleasure to meet you," she greeted Constance with a soft handshake. Then her gaze flicked momentarily to Grace, and Ethan could have sworn he saw a glint of recognition pass between them. But before he could place it, Eliza turned to him. "This is my husband, Ethan Cole," Grace introduced politely. Eliza nodded. "Mr. Cole, a pleasure," she said, offering her hand. He took it, noticing her handshake was firm and deliberate. There was something in her eyes, intelligence, or perhaps a trace of bemusement he couldn't quite decipher. But Ethan dismissed the thought, assuming she was simply adjusting to new surroundings. Grace remained busy showing Eliza around the estate, pointing out her mother's schedule, medication routine, and dietary restrictions. Ethan excused himself to make a business call from Constance's study, pausing at times to overhear fragments of conversation between Grace and Eliza. He caught words like stable vital signs and regular checkups. All standard procedure, he told himself. That evening, Grace insisted everyone gather for a simple dinner, including Eliza, who at first declined, saying she preferred to eat in her quarters. But Grace insisted she join, explaining that she was not just a nurse, but also someone they wanted to welcome into the household. "Please, Eliza, you're going to be part of our daily life here," Grace said with genuine warmth. Eliza hesitated, glancing at Ethan. Finally, she relented, taking a seat at the rustic dining table. Constance was at the head, quietly sipping soup while listening to the conversation swirl around her. Ethan, on Constance's right, used the moment to observe Eliza. He noticed she was not starstruck by the wealth displayed around her, a polished marble floor, glimmering chandeliers, expensive silverware. In fact, she seemed comfortable, as though wealth did not intimidate her. That alone set her apart from most new hires in Ethan's orbit. "So, Eliza," Ethan said, trying to be conversational, "how did you decide on a career in nursing?" She paused, carefully lowering her spoon. "I've always been drawn to caring for people," she replied. "I was close to someone who was very ill during my teenage years, and it changed my perspective on life. I realized that health is fragile, and sometimes a kind word or professional support can make all the difference." Grace nodded encouragingly, while Constance gave Eliza a grateful glance. Something about Eliza's voice was soothing, ethereal almost. In that moment, Ethan felt a peculiar pang, an odd sense of familiarity he couldn't place. It nagged at him like an itch. He tried to push it aside. After dinner, Grace walked with Eliza through the corridor, detailing certain aspects of the estate's security system and emergency protocols. Ethan was left alone to finish his wine in the living room. The fireplace crackled. He caught a glimpse of Eliza's reflection in a nearby mirror, her eyes flicking in his direction for the briefest of seconds before she disappeared into the hallway. The days stretched into a week, and Ethan found himself staying longer than intended in Napa. Partly, he wanted to ensure the new nurse was genuinely competent before leaving Grace's mother under her care. Partly, his flights to New York kept getting postponed due to ongoing negotiations, a convenient reason to remain in the picturesque estate. Constance seemed more at ease, sleeping better, and occasionally surprising them by moving around with more energy. Eliza's presence was undeniably beneficial. However, an undercurrent of tension began to thread itself through each day. Small moments, Ethan catching Eliza studying him from across the room when she thought he wasn't looking. A conversation halted the moment he stepped near. Grace would sometimes flash an odd expression at Eliza, as though recalling an old memory, but unable to piece it together. Ethan sensed there was a history between them, though Grace never mentioned it explicitly. One afternoon, while Constance was napping, Ethan decided to take a walk through the vineyards. The sky was clear, with the sun's warmth mellowed by a gentle breeze. He strolled through rows of meticulously cultivated vines, recalling the early days when Grace had invited him to harvest grapes. He'd been embarrassingly clumsy. He was lost in thought when he heard footsteps behind him. Turning, he saw Eliza, dressed casually, striding up. She must have just finished her shift, because she wore jeans and a light cardigan. "Mind if I walk with you?" she asked. Ethan hesitated only briefly before nodding. Side by side they ambled through the vines, the setting sun dipping behind the rolling hills. He waited for her to speak, but she was silent, occasionally looking around as though absorbing the beauty. Finally, Ethan broke the quiet. "How are you settling in?" She gave a small smile. "Quite well, actually, Mrs. Huntington is a gentle soul, easy to care for once you understand her routines." He nodded. "She is. A good person. Grace is obviously relieved to have found you." Eliza's gaze fell on a cluster of grapes. Her expression was unreadable. "Yes, Grace is kind." Silence again. Wind rustled the leaves. Ethan felt that itch again, a question on the tip of his tongue. He decided to voice it. "I have a feeling you and Grace know each other. Maybe from before. Am I wrong?" Eliza froze. Only for a second, but enough for Ethan to register it. She turned her eyes to him, searching his face. "We might have crossed paths in the past," she said slowly, "but I don't think it's particularly significant." He wanted to press further. Something about her tone told him there was a story there, but before he could ask, she changed the subject, pointing out the beauty of the sky's warm orange glow. They lapsed into a more casual conversation about Napa's climate, the intricacies of caring for older patients, and Eliza's occasional volunteer work in free clinics. She had traveled widely, she said, partly for work, partly for personal reasons. "Sometimes one needs to see the world to understand oneself," she mused, looking off into the distance. The conversation felt unforced, strangely intimate in the hush of the vineyards. Ethan found himself captivated by the nuance in her words, the subtle shifts in her expression. When they finally looped back to the estate, dusk was settling, and the veranda lights flickered on like glowing beacons against the deepening sky. Grace was on the porch, a paperback novel on her lap. The moment she saw Ethan and Eliza return together, her brow furrowed slightly. "Everything all right?" she asked, with a tilt of her head. "Fine," Ethan replied, flashing a casual smile, though he could sense Grace's discomfort. "Just taking in the scenery." Eliza excused herself, walking briskly into the house. It struck Ethan that for all her poise she seemed restless, as though living with some hidden tension. He wanted to know more, but he reminded himself that it was none of his business. She was an employee, a caretaker. His curiosity was unimportant compared to her professional duties. Yet that evening, Ethan's thoughts swirled. He found it difficult to sleep. From the master bedroom's balcony, he watched the moonlight bathe the vineyards, turning them silver. Grace slept soundly, or so it seemed, but around 3 in the morning she stirred. "Ethan," she mumbled, half asleep. "It's okay," he whispered, "just can't sleep." "You should try." Her voice was thick with drowsiness. "We can't stay here forever. We head back to LA next week. I have so much to plan for the next charity event, and you have that New York deal. And Eliza will stay here with Mother." There was a note of relief in her tone. Ethan nodded absently. He was indeed heading back soon. In the quiet of the night, his mind kept returning to Eliza's guarded glances, the cryptic exchange about her possible connection to Grace. He told himself it was just idle curiosity, that once he returned to LA, he'd forget the pretty nurse and her mysteries. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when we're certain we have control. And Ethan Cole, for all his business acumen, was about to learn that some storms you can't outrun, no matter how big your private jet may be. Ethan left for New York to finalize the real estate acquisition, while Grace stayed in Napa for another week. Constance's health seemed to stabilize under Eliza's vigilant care, allowing Grace to immerse herself in philanthropic planning from a cozy study. The trip parted husband and wife once again, him in the hustle of Manhattan's skyscrapers, her in the pastoral calm of Napa. They stayed in contact through phone calls and messages, discussing the usual, business updates, her mother's progress, philanthropic details. Neither mentioned Eliza, though her unspoken presence hung in the spaces between their words. The New York deal, a prime property acquisition near Central Park, was complex. Ethan had assembled a crack team of legal experts, financiers, and real estate consultants. Countless hours were spent in negotiations, peppered with briefings in plush offices, hushed lunches in five-star restaurants. One evening, after a successful day of signing preliminary agreements, Ethan found himself alone in a lavish penthouse suite overlooking the sparkling city. He poured himself a bourbon, the ice clinking against the glass, and stared out at the skyline. The sense of accomplishment he usually felt at landing a deal this significant eluded him. Instead, he thought about Napa's vineyards, Grace's relief at her mother's improvement, and Eliza. He wondered if she was still there, walking the vineyards in the evening, gazing at the sky with that mysterious look in her eyes. Then a question snaked through his mind. "Why do you care, Ethan?" He had never let himself be distracted by an employee before. True, there had been temptations in his past models at charity events, socialites in exotic locales, but Ethan prided himself on self-control, an iron will that matched his billion-dollar empire. And yet something about Eliza unsettled him, a quiet sense of familiarity he could not shrug off. When Ethan returned to Napa a few days later, it was supposed to be a quick stop. He intended to pick up Grace, finalize a few details of Constance's new financial arrangement for in-home care, and then whisk Grace back to Los Angeles for the next wave of philanthropic galas. But as soon as he stepped into the estate's foyer, a hush enveloped him. The staff had become used to the new normal with Eliza, who had seamlessly integrated into the household routine. Constance no longer required around-the-clock monitoring, so Eliza's schedule was more flexible, giving her time for strolls, reading, and even assisting Grace with tasks. Ethan found Grace in the sunroom, flipping through a series of spreadsheets. "Welcome back, stranger," she teased, standing to kiss him on the cheek. He could sense the tension in her body, though she tried to hide it. "How'd it go in New York?" He gave her a capsule summary, concluding with, "It's basically a done deal." Grace offered a polite nod, eyes scanning his face. Then they lapsed into logistic talk. A major fundraiser was coming up in Los Angeles, and Grace would be one of the key speakers. Ethan would need to put in an appearance as well, though his schedule was tighter than ever. At dinner, Ethan noticed that Eliza did not appear. Constance explained that Eliza often preferred to eat in the caretaker's quarters now, citing the need for personal space after a day of assisting her. Grace seemed nonchalant about it. "She's working so hard. A bit of privacy is good for her," Grace said. Later that evening, after Grace retired early from a headache, Ethan wandered the halls. An inexplicable pull led him toward the caretaker's wing, an area he rarely visited. He found Eliza in a small lounge adjacent to her bedroom, reading a medical journal with her feet propped on a coffee table. She looked up in surprise when he appeared. "Mr. Cole," she said, smoothing a lock of hair behind her ear. "Is everything all right with Mrs. Huntington?" "Yes," Ethan replied, stepping in. The lounge was modest, a single couch, a lamp, a bookshelf. The place smelled faintly of lavender and antiseptic, a nurse's trademark. "She's sleeping." Eliza closed her journal. "Good. She's had a stable day, no spikes in blood pressure. I gave her a mild sedative to ensure rest." He nodded, suddenly feeling awkward. A silent moment stretched between them. He cleared his throat. "I suppose I just wanted to see how you're doing. Grace mentioned you like your privacy, so I hope I'm not intruding." She studied him as though weighing his words. Eventually, she offered a small smile. "I appreciate you checking in. It's been interesting living here, different from other assignments." "How so?" he asked, genuinely curious. Her gaze flicked to a framed photograph on the small side table, a black and white shot of Grace as a child, presumably gifted by Constance. Eliza's voice grew quieter. "Sometimes caring for the wealthy can be isolating for a nurse. You're around so much opulence, but you're part of the staff, so it's easy to feel out of place." Then, as though catching herself revealing too much, she sat up straighter. "Not that I'm complaining. Mrs. Huntington has been kind." Ethan took a seat in an armchair across from her. Something in her expression invited deeper conversation. "Is that the only thing that's different?" he probed, trying to catch the subtle shift in her eyes. "I sense you've known Grace from before. You both act like you've crossed paths." Eliza paused, exhaling softly. We crossed paths many years ago, briefly. We didn't really become close friends or anything. It's not something worth mentioning, especially since we never kept in touch." He felt that tension swirl in the small lounge. The rational part of him knew he should stand up, bid her a good night and leave her be. But something else, a curiosity fueled by deeper impulses, kept him rooted to the spot. "Eliza," he said gently, "I don't mean to pry, but if there's history between you two, you can trust me. Grace is my wife. I care about anything that concerns her." Her eyes flashed. For a fleeting second, Ethan saw something akin to pain, but then she composed herself, offering a tight smile. "Your concern is touching, but there's nothing to tell. I promise. Just an old classmate scenario from years ago, nothing dramatic." He nodded slowly, not entirely convinced. Yet pressing further felt intrusive. He rose, giving her a polite nod. "If you ever want to talk, I'm available," he offered, though he wasn't entirely sure what had compelled him to say that. She nodded, her cheeks coloring faintly. "Thanks." He left, a swirl of conflicting emotions trailing in his wake. Later that night, while lying beside Grace, he gazed at her sleeping form, guilt nibbling at him. He told himself it was mere curiosity, the same compulsion that made him a ruthless businessman who never left a stone unturned. But in the recesses of his mind, he sensed the attraction he felt for Eliza was more than intellectual curiosity. He could not deny the flickers of desire that had started to bloom. Events escalated quickly. Over the next few days, Ethan found excuses to linger in Napa, brushing off urgent emails from New York, ignoring the mounting demands from the LA philanthropic circle. For reasons he refused to admit, each day he concocted some business reason to stay. He needed to oversee final paperwork for Constance's insurance. He had to confirm details about the new security system. The real truth was that he wanted more conversations with Eliza. He craved glimpses of her subdued smile, the soft hush of her voice. One warm afternoon, Ethan arrived at the caretaker's quarters under the pretense of checking an electrical problem in the house. He'd claimed to the staff that some lights were flickering, an outright fabrication. He found Eliza on the patio, a book on her lap, overlooking a small flower garden that Constance's father had planted decades ago. She stood up, startled. "Mr. Cole? Did something happen to Mrs. Huntington?" He shook his head, stepping forward. No, Constance is fine. I just... He hesitated, glancing around as though searching for something. I might have made an excuse to come see you. Eliza's eyes widened, and colour rose to her cheeks. Why? She asked, voice trembling slightly. He swallowed. The honesty that poured out surprised even himself. Because I can't stop thinking about you. The words hung heavy in the air. Eliza's face registered an internal war. She pressed her lips together, then exhaled. This is a bad idea, she whispered. Ethan nodded, stepping closer. The soft buzz of insects circled in the bright afternoon sun, while distant chatter from the estate staff occasionally wafted through the air. I know, he said, and he took her hand gently. I can't help it. There's something about you. She tried to pull away, but not entirely. Her eyes glimmered with tears that threatened to spill. Ethan, I'm your wife's employee. I take care of her mother. This is all kinds of wrong. He gently let go of her hand, conscious of the boundary they were poised to cross. We're both adults, he said, his voice low. I'm not asking for anything more than a conversation, a chance to know you, really know you. She shook her head, stepping back, her arms wrapping protectively around her torso. No, I can't. Not here. Not now. Her voice wavered. Please, just respect that. A sense of shame mingled with desire in Ethan's gut. He closed his eyes, inhaling deeply. All right, he said, stepping away. I'm sorry. I won't push you. Yet the flame of forbidden attraction had been lit, and deep down he suspected this was only the beginning. That night, Ethan lay awake, mind racing through the consequences of what he was feeling. Grace had been nothing but devoted, and though they were distant, he knew she still cared. One reckless move could unravel the entire life he built. But the more he fought it, the stronger the pull toward Eliza became. He reasoned with himself, maybe it was just an infatuation, something that would fade. Or maybe it was a sign of deeper dissatisfaction with his marriage, a symptom of a life that had grown stale and predictable. Days passed in an agonizing dance of avoidance and attraction. Eliza made herself scarce, leaving Ethan to pace restlessly across the estate. He found reasons to corner her, short interactions that burned with unsaid words. Each time she exuded a turmoil that mirrored his own, an undeniable desire tempered by shame and fear. In the midst of this emotional storm, Grace, oblivious to the mounting tension, prepared for their return to Los Angeles. The private plane was scheduled for the next week. She spent her days finalizing Constance's care instructions with Eliza, cross-checking medication lists, ensuring the staff was well informed. Each time Ethan witnessed them together, a pang of guilt stabbed him. Yet the guilt did nothing to quell the longing that tormented him at night. Finally, on the eve of their departure, the unthinkable happened. Late into the night, Ethan was in the hallway, returning from a phone call in the estate office. He saw a small light under Eliza's door. On a reckless impulse, he knocked softly. She opened the door, wearing a plain nightgown, her hair loose around her shoulders. The sight of her nearly stole his breath. "Ethan, what are you?" Before she could finish, he seized her in a passionate, desperate kiss. For a moment, she froze, then responded with equal hunger. It was like a dam bursting. Weeks of suppressed desire flooded them. She tugged him into the room, and the door clicked shut behind them. In that rush, the weight of moral considerations, marital vows, professional boundaries, all were drowned out by a pulsing tide of lust and loneliness. For a few hours, they escaped into each other, clinging as though each touch could fill the voids in their hearts. In the aftermath, as dawn lightened the sky, guilt seeped in. They lay tangled in the sheets, and Eliza stared at the ceiling, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. "What have we done?" she whispered. Ethan closed his eyes, his heart pounding. He had never felt so alive and so ashamed simultaneously. Leaning on an elbow, he tried to brush away her tears, but she turned her face away as though repulsed by her own choices. "I shouldn't have," she began, voice breaking. He held her gently. "We both did this. Let's figure it out." But deep down, he felt the first rumblings of dread, because there was no easy way to figure out betraying one's spouse or crossing professional ethics, and something told him Eliza's past connection to Grace was more profound than she let on. In that hollow, exhausted silence, the hush of mourning enveloped them. Outside, the estate was waking up, staff preparing breakfast, birds beginning their dawn chorus. Inside, two people lay in bed, bound by something illicit and irreversible. Neither of them knew it yet, but the tragedy they were setting in motion would soon engulf more than their reputations and consciences. It would shatter lives in ways they couldn't imagine. Grace and Ethan returned to Los Angeles as planned, leaving Eliza in charge of Constance's care. It was an arrangement that had been set up weeks in advance, ensuring Constance's well-being in the presence of a trusted nurse. But the tension from that night lingered like a dark cloud on the horizon. Ethan had parted from Eliza at dawn, with one last anguished glance. Eliza's whispered plea had followed him onto the plane. "Don't contact me. I need space. This can't happen again." Back in their Beverly Hills mansion, Ethan tried to slip into the rhythms of his high-profile life. He attended philanthropic meetings alongside Grace, gave interviews about his successful New York acquisition, and resumed negotiations for other deals. But he was haunted by the memory of Eliza, the softness of her skin, the vulnerability in her eyes when she whispered his name in the dark. He couldn't concentrate for more than a few hours without replaying that night in his mind. Grace, for her part, noticed the strain in his demeanor. She assumed it was business stress. One evening, after a charity event, she cornered him in their spacious bedroom. "Ethan, you're distant, even more than usual. Is everything all right?" she asked, concern coloring her voice. He couldn't meet her gaze. "It's fine, Grace, just the usual investment headaches." He forced a small smile, leaning in to kiss her cheek. She stiffened slightly, as though sensing his evasiveness. Time moved forward with excruciating slowness. Ethan heard only through Grace's updates that Constance was stable, thanks to Eliza's care. He avoided calling Eliza outright. Part of him respected her request for space. Another part feared what might be said if they did speak. Yet the longing gnawed at him. 2 weeks later, fate intervened in the form of an unexpected phone call. It was Constance's estate manager, sounding urgent. "Mr. Cole, there's been an incident at the Napa house." Ethan's heart hammered. "Is Constance okay?" "Yes, she's fine, but Miss Martin was attacked while driving in town last night. She's stable now, but in the hospital with a concussion." The word sent a shockwave through Ethan. He forced himself to remain composed while extracting details. The caretaker's Toyota had been sideswiped by a drunk driver. Eliza was thrown against the steering wheel, sustaining injuries that required a hospital stay. Once the phone call ended, Ethan found himself breathless, consumed by a fierce need to see her. Grace's reaction was immediate. "I'm going to Napa to be with Mother and see if Eliza needs anything. She must be terrified," she said, summoning the staff to pack her bags. Ethan's stomach twisted. He wanted to be there, but he worried about the tension of seeing Eliza. "I'll come with you," he offered, trying to sound casual. They flew to Napa that very night. On arrival, Grace insisted on going straight to the hospital, where they found Eliza in a private room, her head bandaged, her face sporting a dark bruise along her cheek. Constance had insisted on covering all medical expenses. Upon seeing Grace and Ethan, Eliza's expression wavered between relief and anxiety. She managed a small, polite smile for Grace's sake. "Oh, Eliza," Grace murmured, approaching her bedside. "I'm so sorry this happened. Are you in much pain?" Eliza winced slightly. "It's manageable thanks to the meds. The doctor says I should be okay in a week or so, just need rest." She then glanced at Ethan, her eyes flashing with unspoken tension. "Mr. Cole." He cleared his throat, forcing a smile. "Good to see you're conscious. That's a relief." An uncomfortable silence threatened to take hold, but Grace kept talking, offering to arrange for in-home therapy at Constance's estate. The hospital staff gave a rundown of the injuries: a moderate concussion, some bruised ribs, minor lacerations. "She's lucky," the nurse concluded. "It could have been much worse." Afterward, Grace stepped outside to speak with the doctors. Ethan stayed behind, drawn irresistibly to Eliza's side. She reached for his hand, her grip trembling. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her eyes brimming with tears. He leaned closer. "Why are you apologizing? You got hurt." She swallowed hard. "I tried to keep distance, but there's so much I need to tell you." Her voice faltered. "And I'm terrified." His mind raced. He squeezed her hand gently. "You can tell me anything." Before she could respond, Grace re-entered the room, voice brimming with relief. "They say you can be discharged tomorrow, and we'll have a live-in therapist to help you recover at the estate. I want you to focus on getting better." Eliza nodded, her gaze lingering on Ethan, pregnant with secrets unspoken. The next day saw Eliza settled back into the caretaker's quarters, albeit wearing bandages and leaning on a cane for support. Constance insisted she not resume duties immediately, urging her to recover fully. Grace spent hours fussing over her mother and Eliza, ensuring the correct medication was administered, the living space was comfortable, and that no detail was overlooked. Ethan helped in small ways, arranging for top-tier doctors to make house calls, setting up a short-term disability plan. But truly, he was counting the moments until he could be alone with Eliza. That chance arrived on a crisp afternoon, when Grace drove Constance to a follow-up appointment in the next town. The staff was sparse, mostly in other parts of the estate. Ethan found Eliza resting in a lounge chair in the sunroom, gazing at the vineyards through large windows. He approached her cautiously. "How are you feeling?" She grimaced, shifting slightly. "Sore, but better." He sat near her, the sunlight glinting off his watch. "You said you had something to tell me." She bit her lip. "Yes." A trembling breath. "This might change everything, Ethan. I knew Grace back in college. We were roommates for a semester. She was kind, but I wasn't in a good place. I struggled financially, took questionable jobs. I was embarrassed. Then something terrible happened. My younger sister died from a rare condition. I left college to care for her during her final weeks. Grace offered help, but I was too proud or angry at the world to accept." Tears rimmed her eyes. Ethan squeezed her hand softly. "I'm so sorry." She continued, voice shaking. "Fast forward years later. I became a traveling nurse, got involved in some relationships that ended badly. Last year my father fell ill, and we sank into debt. I heard Grace had married a billionaire. She was living a life of privilege, continuing her philanthropic works. For a while, I resented her. She offered me help once, but I refused, and now she's living in this mansion with everything she could ever want." Ethan's heart pounded. He wanted to console her, to say that Grace's wealth didn't define her compassion, but Eliza pressed on. "When I applied for this job, I did it partly because I needed the money, and partly because a mutual friend told me Grace was looking for a nurse for her mother. I never intended to have any involvement with you. That was never my plan. But when I saw you, I recognized the same cracks in you that I have in me, and everything got complicated." Silence fell, filled only by the hum of a distant air conditioner. Ethan finally found his voice. "Eliza, that doesn't change how I feel about you, or how I feel about Grace. I'm torn, but that's the truth." Her eyes closed. "I care about you too, but this can't go on. If Grace knew, she'd be devastated." The mention of Grace's potential heartbreak weighed on him like a mountain. He stood up, pacing, raking a hand through his hair. "I know," he admitted. "I don't want to hurt her, but—" He cut off, emotion choking him. Eliza's voice, soft but resolute, filled the room. "It has to stop, Ethan. I can't be responsible for breaking her. She once tried to help me when I had nobody. She's not just your wife, she's the only person who ever showed me unconditional kindness when I was at my lowest." Tears finally spilled down Eliza's cheeks. Ethan knelt beside her, wrapping his arms around her trembling shoulders, feeling his own tears threaten to surface. They stayed like that for several moments, an embrace weighted with guilt, regret, and an impossible longing. "You're right," Ethan murmured. "We have to end this." Little did either of them know, fate still had a cruel twist in store. For Grace, who had unwittingly dedicated her life to bridging social gaps and healing wounds, was about to find herself at the epicenter of a betrayal that would send shockwaves through every relationship in her life. That evening, as Grace returned with Constance, Ethan resolved to bury the affair and never speak of it again. He was determined to distance himself from Eliza, to treat her with the professional courtesy befitting her role. He had thought it would be simple enough, a quiet resolution that left his marriage intact, Grace unhurt, and Eliza with her dignity. But secrets have a way of surfacing, and hearts rarely relinquish desire just because the mind insists on it. Even as Ethan tried to appear calm at dinner, the tension in the air was palpable. Grace looked at him strangely, as if reading the unsaid turmoil behind his carefully neutral expression. Meanwhile, Eliza avoided eye contact, her posture rigid, and indeed, the unspoken drama would soon ignite like a tinderbox. The seeds of tragedy were sown, ready to burst into flames in a final, inevitable reckoning. A week passed in uneasy silence. Eliza's health improved, her bandages removed, her limp less noticeable. She fell back into her caregiving routine. Ethan and Grace were due to leave Napa again soon, with Grace planning another philanthropic tour. As the flight date neared, Ethan steeled himself to leave Eliza behind once more, clinging to the hope that physical distance would quell the tumult in his heart. But 2 nights before their departure, a confrontation shattered the precarious balance. Grace had been rummaging through a spare closet for an old family photo album. She stumbled upon a crumpled piece of paper, an airline ticket stub from a flight Ethan had supposedly cancelled. It was from the very week he'd extended his stay in Napa without a concrete explanation. Suspicion kindled in her mind. After a bit of investigative fervor, she unearthed more inconsistencies, receipts for late-night meals that Ethan had never mentioned, odd times he'd claimed to be handling business issues at the estate. Nerves twisting in her gut, Grace decided to keep her findings private until she could speak to Eliza. That same night, as the moon hung low over the vineyards, she found Eliza organizing medication in Constance's room. Grace closed the door softly, her expression resolute. "Eliza," she said in a hushed tone, "I need to ask you something personal." Eliza glanced at her, eyes flicking anxiously. "Sure." Grace hesitated, pressing her lips together. "Has my husband Ethan done anything to make you uncomfortable?" Eliza nearly dropped the pill bottle. She recovered quickly, shaking her head. "No, Grace, of course not. He's been polite." Grace studied her, searching for any hint of deception. "Because I've noticed changes in his behavior. He's secretive, distant, and I don't know. I felt this tension, especially when you're both in the same room." Eliza's hand trembled as she placed the bottle on the bedside table. "Grace, you're imagining things," she said softly, her gaze fixed on the floor. "Ethan is your husband. He loves you." But even as she said the words, her voice wavered. Grace's eyes filled with tears. "Eliza, I'm not a fool. I've known you for longer than you think. You were always independent, strong-willed, but secrets breed havoc. Please, if something is going on, I need the truth." Eliza's resolve crumbled. She sank onto the edge of the bed, unable to meet Grace's eyes. There, under the dim lamp illuminating Constance's peaceful slumber, Eliza sobbed quietly, each tear unraveling her composure. Moments later, Grace wrapped her arms around Eliza, tears also streaming down her cheeks. Neither spoke a word, but in that heartbreak-laden silence, the truth was laid bare. A quiet, anguished confession followed, how the affair had begun as an emotional spark, a longing unacknowledged. How one night in the caretaker's quarters had sealed their fates. Grace's face contorted with hurt, betrayal, and a wave of heartbreak that stole her breath. She pulled away, staggering to her feet. "How could you?" she whispered, voice cracking. "You, my friend, my mother's nurse, and Ethan, my husband." Eliza could only cry, her body shaking with grief. Grace stormed out, her fury colliding with devastation. She found Ethan pacing in the hallway. He had overheard raised voices and rushed from his study. Seeing Grace's tear-streaked face, he froze. "Grace, what's wrong?" he asked shakily. She glared at him, eyes flashing with anger so intense it bordered on hatred. "You did this," she hissed, words trembling with the force of her emotion. Then she sank to her knees on the hallway carpet, sobbing uncontrollably. Ethan rushed to her, but she shoved him away. "Don't touch me," she screamed. "You betrayed me, Ethan. You and Eliza. How dare you?" Confusion flickered in his eyes, then realization struck like a blow. He stood, pale as a ghost, hands shaking. "Grace, She scrambled to her feet, stepping back as though he were a venomous snake. "How long?" she demanded. "How long have you been sleeping with her?" He opened and closed his mouth, words failing him. Eventually he managed a strangled reply. "It was a mistake. It happened once. We ended it. Grace, I never wanted to hurt you. I love you." But the words sounded hollow in the echoing corridor, overshadowed by the magnitude of betrayal. In the adjacent room, Eliza sobbed softly, guilt swallowing her whole. Constance, awakened by the shouting, called out in confusion. Grace marched out to the driveway, fumbling for her car keys. Ethan followed, pleading, but she roared the engine of her SUV and peeled away from the estate with a screech of tires. Panic soared in Ethan's chest. He rushed back inside, frantically ordering the staff to look after Constance, and jumped into another vehicle to chase Grace. But by then, she was gone, speeding down the rural roads, tears blurring her vision. The meltdown spiraled toward disaster. In her distraught state, Grace drove recklessly. She took a sharp turn too quickly, the SUV fishtailing on loose gravel. The last thing Grace saw was the crooked silhouette of a tree looming in her headlights. The crash thundered through the quiet night, metal screeching, glass shattering, a final scream snuffed out in an instant. When Ethan arrived on the scene, sirens blared and ambulance lights splashed red and blue across the twisted wreckage. He sprinted to the wreck, ignoring the paramedics' attempts to hold him back. The sight that greeted him seared into his mind forever. Grace pinned against the steering wheel, unconscious, blood matting her hair. Lifeless eyes stared at him, as if condemning him with her final breath. For a brief, desperate moment, Ethan believed the paramedics could save her. He tried to scream her name, but no sound came. The EMT shook his head solemnly. Grace Cole was gone. In the weeks that followed, a funeral shrouded in black took place at the elegant family chapel in Napa. The press circled like vultures, picking up rumors of tension in the Cole marriage, the suspicious circumstances of Grace's sudden drive at night. To the public, the official story was that she died in a tragic accident. Only a few close staff knew the broader truth that heartbreak and betrayal paved the road to her death. Eliza, consumed by grief and guilt, resigned from her position the day after Grace's passing. She left a handwritten letter for Ethan. "I am sorry. This is all my fault. I'm leaving California for good. I hope you can find peace someday." Ethan never saw her again. As for Ethan Cole, he was left with an empire of wealth that felt meaningless, without Grace at his side. In press interviews, he looked gaunt and hollow-eyed. He continued his philanthropic efforts in her name, building foundations to support mental health services, trying to atone for a guilt too heavy to ever truly absolve. Some nights he sat alone in their Beverly Hills mansion, haunted by memories of Grace's gentle touch, her earnest smile, and the tragedy that stained every corner of his existence. In an attempt to salvage something of worth from the wreckage, Ethan poured resources into the Grace Cole Foundation for community healing. Clinics were built in underserved areas, scholarships were established for aspiring nurses, and irony never lost on him. He named one of the scholarships after Eliza Martin, though he never reached out to her again. He didn't even know if she'd discover his quiet tribute. It was simply his way of acknowledging a love that was as illicit as it was tragic. Years later, those who knew the story spoke in hushed tones about the billionaire who lost his wife and vanished from the social scene soon after. Some claimed they spotted him in remote corners of the world, working incognito as a volunteer, trying to do penance. Others whispered that he eventually found Eliza, and they started a new life. But nobody knew for sure. The only certainty was that one fateful night had shattered the veneer of wealth and ambition, laying bare the raw, destructive power of desire and betrayal. In the end, the cautionary tale of Ethan Cole, Grace Cole, and Eliza Martin resonated far beyond their circle. Their story became a parable of moral frailty, the fragile balance between ambition and love, and the devastating consequences of deception. For those who heard it, there was a single takeaway that emerged like a quiet beacon of truth. No amount of money, prestige, or carefully cultivated image can replace the sanctity of trust, and once broken, that trust can lead to irreparable tragedy. The Cole Foundation continued to flourish, ironically championing the ideals Grace had always held dear: compassion, authenticity, and resilience in the face of life's hardships. Perhaps that was Ethan's final gift to the woman he had so deeply wronged, dedicating the remnants of his broken empire to the greater good. In doing so, he kept a fragment of Grace's spirit alive, a testament that out of the darkest tragedies, a flicker of hope might still emerge. In remembering her life, many spoke of Grace as an angel of kindness, a guiding light for the powerless. And in the echo of her death, they learned this solemn truth: resilience is born from facing our deepest regrets. Genuine connection transcends the illusions of wealth. And authenticity is found only when we confront who we truly are, even if it takes a lifetime to atone for one ill-fated night that changed everything. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe for more tales that inspire deep thought, foster understanding, and explore the complexity of human emotions. Together, let's learn from these narratives and strive to be better in our own lives.